I love Family Sundays. It's such a gift to be reminded of all the kids in our midst. You know, when a group of children wanted to come and I would say sit on Jesus' lap and interact with him, the disciples were like, children are not supposed to be seen or heard. They're supposed to stay in the background. Jesus said, no, let them come. Let them come. They're an illustration of how we're to receive the kingdom of God with simplicity and faith. And so I think it's a gift when we're all reminded together of the little faces and the little voices in our midst. They're evidence that there's life here. And that we have a job, we have an investment to make in the lives of the kids that God has given us. So, girls, I'm actually glad you're down here. You won't bother me at all, okay? So, do your thing. Louis Zamperini was a runner. And he was good enough to compete in the 1936 Olympics in Berlin. And after World War II broke out, he became a bombardier on a B-24. Well, at one point, his plane went down in the Pacific Ocean, and he and another crewman survived aboard a raft adrift on the open ocean for 47 days. After being rescued from the water by enemy forces, both men became prisoners of war and were eventually sent to Japanese POW camps. Louis endured constant brutality at the hands of a man the prisoners referred to as the Bird. His real name was Mitsuhiro Watanabe, and he was by all accounts a cruel and abusive soldier who terrorized prisoners. In fact, he had it out for this once Olympic athlete whom he regarded as, quote, his #1 prisoner. So Louis experienced even worse treatment than his comrades. After his prison camp was liberated and he returned to the U.S., he returned as a war hero. He even went on speaking tours. But despite outward appearances, his life was completely falling apart. He was struggling to cope with his horrific experiences during his 2 years as a POW in Japan. Watanabe was a constant face in his nightmares. Zamperini found that he was in many ways still under the control and the power of the Bird. Filled with anger and anxiety and hatred, he found solace in alcohol and in concocting plans to return to Japan and to murder the Bird. This was the only way that Louis felt that he could finally be free of it. As he continued to withdraw into depression and into alcoholism, he would lash out unpredictably. He was on the verge, in fact, of losing his family. In his own words, I got married. I had a little girl. I continued to drink and continued to party, and my wife refused to do that with me. Pretty soon, I found myself fading away, to the point where I realized that I was in serious need of help. In 1949, he reluctantly attended a Billy Graham crusade meeting at the request of his wife. Now, this was the very first extended crusade Billy Graham had ever done, and it was in Los Angeles. After the first night, he told his wife that he would never go to anything like that in his entire life. That is, until he agreed to go back with her the second. It was on that night that the Lord saved him, and he became a different man. Amazingly, after his conversion, Zamperini's desire for vengeance left him completely. During a speaking tour in Tokyo, of all places, in 1952, he had the opportunity to meet with prisoners at Sagamu Prison, which was filled with 850 Japanese war criminals. After speaking to the prisoners, Louis had requested to meet with his former guards personally. Again, in his own words, I looked out and saw them coming down the aisle, and of course, I recognized each one of them vividly. I didn't even think of my reaction. I jumped off stage, ran down, threw my arms around them, and they withdrew from me. They couldn't understand the forgiveness. We went into the room, and there, of course, I continued to press the issue of Christianity, you see, and all but one of them made a decision for Christ. Louis even attempted to meet with Watanabe when he returned to Japan as part of the Olympic ceremonies in 1998, but his former captor refused. Instead, Louis sent him a letter which expressed his forgiveness. Now, Louis Zamperini's life gained widespread attention through the book and the movie titled Unbroken. Many of you may have read the book and you may have seen the movie. And it's an incredible story of redemption. In fact, it's a story that's not unlike Esther's. And when we meet Esther this morning, some of you may be surprised at what you find out about her when she first comes on the scene. But I'm hoping that by the end of today's sermon, you'll be excited not only to see where she is, but more importantly, where God is going to take her. Now, let me say this at the outset, okay? It hit me this past week that I was going to be preaching Esther 2 on Family Sunday. So I spent the better part of the week trying to figure out exactly how to do that and exactly what to say. So here's what's going to happen. There are going to be times when I'm going to look at you and I'm going to wink, or I'm going to say, read between the lines. Right? I'm going to leave it up to you to fill in any details. Is that a deal? Right. Here we go. Esther chapter 2, verse 1. After these things. Now let's stop right there. Let's set the context again. After what things? Right? We are at least 3 years removed from chapter 1. After chapter 1, King Ahasuerus has campaigned against the Greeks. He's lost that campaign. He's come home a defeated man. So after these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had abated, he remembered Vashti, his former queen, and what she had done, refusing to come into his presence when called, and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's young men who attended him said, let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in Susa the capital, under custody of Hegai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women. Let their cosmetics be given them, and let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This pleased the king, and he did so. Well, of course it did. Read between the lines, right? You gotta practice this. Now, you and I cannot possibly imagine living in a world where everyone existed to serve and to please the king, where the entire mythology that permeated the entire culture and everyone's lives led every single person to believe that he was a god to whom ultimate allegiance was owed, a God who said jump and everyone said ah. Okay? But that was Persian culture. Everyone and everything was at his mercy. And so he comes back from his failed campaign against the Greeks, and he's a downtrodden king, and he begins to think about what happened to Vashti, or rather what he did to Vashti, and the text indicates that he's regretful, that he wishes at this point, probably 3 years removed, that he had not done what he did. And so his officials, his servants, notice this, and they say, hey, what you need is another queen, and we've got a plan. We've got a plan, in fact, that we think will please you very much. This is what you ought to do. You ought to gather up all the beautiful young virgins in the kingdom, have them come to your palace and enter a competition, and then you'll decide decide based on who wins the competition who will be the next queen. So the king says, that sounds great to me. Let's do it. Now when it comes down to it, though you and I don't live in that particular world, and we may not be able to enter in completely to that kind of culture, the reality is that our world is spiritually no different from theirs. Idolatry is alive and well in our world. And though the false god of ancient Persia may have been a dictator, the false gods in our own time are no different from the ones that demanded allegiance and sacrifice in his world. In fact, the very things that were to drive a new search for a queen are the same things that are idolized in our own culture. Physical attractiveness, youth, and sex. Three of the biggies that we tend to put a lot of weight on in our own culture. And so what was the king promising? Look at verse 4. And he says, and let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. The king was promising a clear-cut path to the good life for the most attractive and alluring woman in his kingdom. And you see, we've got to connect the dots between that culture and this one to see that our own culture sells us the same story and promises us the same compelling outcome. If we will just bow down to the prevailing idols of our own culture, then the good life, fill in the blank, will be the result. The king of Persia ultimately deceived most of the young women who participated in that competition. And like the king of Persia, the idols of our own day, they deceived too. In fact, they enslaved. For behind them is a dark power who seeks to convince you and me that we can have the world if we will just bow the knee to him. This is exactly what this dark power did with Jesus, right? Matthew chapter 4, verses 8 through 10. Look at that with me quickly. Matthew chapter 4. Again, so here we are. We're putting down in the middle of Jesus' temptations, and the devil has come to him twice. Now he's coming to Jesus a third time, and he says again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory. And he said to him, all of these I will give you if you will fall down and worship me. Then Jesus said to him, be gone, Satan, for it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only you shall serve. Thank God that Jesus could see through what we often do not. The false promises of a false God are empty and worthless, and they're not to be desired over the God who has shown us in his word that we should worship him and him alone. So here at the outset of chapter 2, you have the king of ancient Persia who's engaging all of the beautiful young virgins of the empire in a competition to see who will become his next queen. Enter the two main characters of our story. Verse 5. Now there was a Jew in Susa the citadel whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjaminite who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. He was bringing up Hadassah, her Jewish name, that is Esther, her Persian name, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at, so that ties her in with this search that the king's got going on, right? And when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in Susa the citadel in custody of Hegai, Esther also was taken into the king's palace and put in custody of Haggai, who had charge of the women. And the young woman pleased him and won his favor. And he quickly provided her with her cosmetics and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen young women from the king's palace, and advanced her and her young women to the best place in the harem. Esther had not made known her people or kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. And every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her. So here we're introduced to Mordecai, who is a Jew living in the capital city of the Persian Empire, and he's raising his cousin, Esther, whose parents, we're told, have died. And there's something significant that you need to know about Esther right from the beginning. She is a girl with 2 names. In fact, she's the only character in the entire story introduced by both her Jewish name and her Persian name. And that's significant. It signifies the fact that she is a young woman caught between 2 worlds. Perhaps even that she's an internally conflicted person. She has a Jewish identity on one hand and a Persian identity on the other. And she doesn't quite know how to live in both worlds. She doesn't know how to be faithful to God while living in a pagan culture that doesn't support her Jewish beliefs. Sounds a lot like the culture in which we live, right? A culture in which our own identities are conflicted. How do we live out our Christian convictions in a culture that clearly does not support those beliefs? Now the text goes on to tell us, and I pointed it out to you, that she was a beautiful woman, lovely to look at. And so naturally, she was chosen. She was taken. She was made to participate in the king's beauty contest, if you will, so that he can find another queen. Now here's what the text doesn't tell us, okay? The text doesn't tell us if she resisted. The text doesn't tell us if she went willingly and enthusiastically. I'm sure both responses happened throughout the empire. I'm sure there were some young women who didn't want to go, who wanted to remain at home, who wanted to remain with their families. And I'm sure there were others who were enthusiastic about it. After all, it's not every day that you get a chance to win the crown and the throne of an empire. And life in the ancient world was hard. It was brutal. And to win this competition meant that you would live in the lap of luxury for the rest of your life. But here's what we do know. We do know that Esther quickly made a name for herself. She quickly gained a good reputation among the women who were chosen to be part of this competition. And it seems that at some point along the way, she decided she was in it to win it. Okay? That's what the text seems to say. Verse 9. And the young woman pleased Haggai and won his favor. And she was quickly promoted along with her 7 servants to the very choicest place in the king's harem. So here's the deal. Regardless of whether or not she was taken against her will, whether she went with the king's officials enthusiastically, she soon embraced the values of the palace and the competition, and essentially left her Jewish identity behind. In fact, she's never called by her Jewish name again in the rest of the book. She becomes Esther from this point on. So here's a good question. Could she have resisted at any point along the way? Daniel did. Did you know the story of Daniel takes place not 40 years prior to this one? When Daniel was asked to do things that violated his biblically informed conscience, he went that far and no further. So did his 3 friends. Was it costly for them? If a fiery furnace and a pit of lions is costly, yes. Would it have been costly for her? Probably so. But here's the deal. To reject it and to embrace the idols of her surroundings. She basically goes dark. She basically adopts a secret identity. And there's no indication at this point in the text that she has any reason to be afraid of being a Jew in that environment. Now that'll come, but there's no indication here that that's the case. Why does Esther do this? And why do we sometimes do things like this? Why do we hide our Christian identity? Why do we give ourselves over to false gods and their empty promises? Now for Esther, it could be just a simple power grab, okay? The king promised a royal crown to the winner, and she wanted it. In the same way, we too, man, we just want what the idols offer. We want what they promise. In exchange for our sacrifices, they promise wealth and prestige and happiness and pleasure and a life of ease if we will just submit ourselves to them. Esther could have been dazzled by all of the things that she was seeing, and they could have overtaken her heart, and she could have said, I'm in it to win it because this life will be awesome. But there's another side to this story too. I think it could also have something to do with Esther's past. Look back at chapter 2, verse 5, okay? And notice some things with it. Now there was a Jew in Susa the citadel whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, of Benjaminite, who had been, and you can underline this phrase, carried away from Jerusalem among the captives, carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. Man, y'all, Esther's been through a lot. She's part of a people who have been downtrodden for decades. Because of their disobedience to the Lord, they have been carried away into exile. And it's quite possible that she was born there and that she's not known anything different than the exile of her ancestors. And so here she is, part of this kind of beaten down people, and that's not only part of her backstory. What else has she lost? Her mom and her dad. Who knows what Esther may have been going through? Who knows what wounds she carried around in her own heart? Think about it for just a minute. Here's a real chance for a broken girl to make something of herself and her life. To do something and to become somebody. And so what does she do? She jumps in with everything she's got. And don't we often do the same thing? Don't the ways that we sin and the idols that we turn to have a lot to do with the ways that we've suffered and the wounds that we carry? Think of the young man who's constantly told by his dad that he's stupid and that he'll never amount to anything. Why does he sacrifice his life, his relationships, and other people along the way as he climbs the corporate ladder of supposed success? Why does he give himself to the idol of work except to hear somebody say to him, I'm proud of you. You're a good man. Or think of the young woman who's told relentlessly by her ever-critical mother that she's too fat, that she'll never be able to land a man, and that she'll die old and lonely. Why does she find herself in the arms of man after man after man, every one of them who tells her she's beautiful, that she's the only one for them, and she's the best one they've ever had? Meanwhile, she wakes up in the morning, and one by one, they're nowhere to be found. Don't you think she wants to hear somebody say, you're beautiful. You're going to make it. I'm proud of you. You see, a lot of times, the sins that we engage in, the idols that we chase after, they're directly connected to wounds that we've suffered, to things that we've endured. And the enemy of our souls knows those things all too well. He knows the ways that we've been sinned against. He knows the ways that you and I have suffered. He knows the things that have done a number on our hearts and our minds. And He knows, listen, He knows that when we're hurt, it's relatively easy to fall prey to the promises of a false God that promises to heal our wounds. My question is that you? Is that you this morning? Are you chasing hard after someone or something in hopes that it'll heal the wounds that you carry? People who have suffered and struggled through addiction, I think, know this all too well. Competition. Enter this conflicted Jewish girl growing up in a pagan culture. And then we come to find out what all of these promises of this empty God become, beginning in verse 12. Now when the turn came for each young woman to go into King Ahasuerus after 12 months under the regulations for the women, since this was the regular period of their beautifying, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with spices and ointments for women. Ladies, don't you see how this could have been appealing? Pampered for an entire year. Right? Verse 13, when the young women went into the king in this way, she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. Now, this is one of those moments, I'm going to wink at you, and I'm going to say, read between the lines. When the young woman went into the king in this way, she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening, she would go in, and in the morning, she would return to the second harem in custody of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She would not go into the king again unless the king delighted in her and she was summoned by name. Okay, here's the reality. Only one person would win this competition. Just one. And all of the rest would be cast aside. Even the winner would always be looking over her shoulder, aware of the fact that the king could get rid of her as quickly as he had gotten rid of Vashti and replace her with any number of women in his harem. All of those who did not win the competition, and this is what the text says, would be placed in a second harem where they would live out their days in comfortable isolation. If they had been with the king, they could never be with another man for the rest of their lives. So they would live out their days unable to return home, unable to marry, unable to have children, and unable to return to the king's bedroom unless he called for them by name. That's a pretty poor, pathetic excuse for a life. I can't even imagine the misery and the pain of an existence like that. But here's what you and I need to see. Way back up at the beginning of this chapter, this competition was open to every eligible young woman in the kingdom. When you get here to this point, you see that the promises of false gods like the Persian king ultimately come to nothing. They come to nothing. They exact a toll on you and they leave you empty. They enslave you, use you, and discard you. Because truth be told, there's always someone who's more physically attractive, right? Right? Someone else is going to win the Miss Universe pageant next year, and the year after that, and the year after that. There's always someone younger, right? There's always the promise of a new and better experience with someone else, someone better. Someone with that chemistry and that connection, right? Someone with those fireworks. Here's my prayer. As I've kind of thought about this text this week and I've gotten to this point in my studies, I've thought, okay, God, would you use this text today to bring someone in this room to their senses, to help each of us see things as they really are, to see through all the promises and all the supposed power to the emptiness behind the curtain. Because that's what the promises of false gods are. They're empty. Now here's the thing. What happens next argues against this. Okay? Listen to the text. Verse 15. When the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his own daughter to go into the king, she asked for nothing except what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who had charge of the women, advised. Now Esther was winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her. Okay, her beauty is the means by which she's earning favor with all of these people. And when Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign, the king loved Esther more than all the other women. And she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the other virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king gave a great feast for all his officials and servants. It was Esther's feast. He also granted a remission of taxes to the provinces and gave gifts with royal generosity. Now, against all odds, Esther wins this competition. But make no mistake about what she had to do to win. Wink, wink. Okay? One author perhaps has said it better than I ever could. He says, in many ways, Esther's rise to power in the Persian Empire resembles the story of Cinderella. In the fairy tale, the prince is in search of his true love, so he gathers all the eligible bachelorettes in the kingdom to a ball. When Cinderella captures his heart, she goes from rags to riches. Similarly, the Persian king is searching for a new queen, and he also gathers all of the eligible bachelorettes in the empire to the royal palace. Esther impresses the king more than anyone else, and she too goes from royal rags to riches. The big difference, however, is that Cinderella captures the royal heart by dancing, whereas Esther has to do more than just dance. That's a read between the lines. Okay. Here's the deal. Based on everything we see in this text, Esther has completely compromised her identity as a Jew. She has slept with a man who isn't her husband. She's become the wife of a pagan, non-God-fearing Gentile. She's probably had to break all of the Jewish food laws and the Sabbath laws in order to fully submerge herself into the pagan culture of the palace. In effect, she's thrown herself into the very things that led the Jewish people into the exile in the first place. The great sin, after all, of the Old Testament is assimilation, or capitulation to the world around them. One author writes, foreign gods, foreign wives, unclean practices. Israel was to be set apart and distinct. When they lose their hard edges, when they lose touch with their distinctive way of life, calamity ensues. But not for us. What in the world is going on here? She's concealed her identity as Hadassah, and she's become Esther. And it's a fitting name because her namesake, Ishtar, was the Babylonian goddess of love and war. And just as we saw in chapter 1, so in chapter 2, God is nowhere to be found. In fact, based on everything we see, he's not even an important part of Esther's life at this point in the story. Now, what are we to make of this? First, it's a reminder that the heroes and the heroines of the Bible were real people with feet of clay. We're not meant to lift the heroes of the Bible up and put them on a pedestal. They often made mistakes. They, in fact, often dove headlong into sin. What we see here is a reminder that there really only is and ever will be one hero in the Bible. Who is it? Jesus. Okay? And God always uses crooked sticks to draw straight lines. If he didn't, you and I wouldn't have a part to play in his story either. But thank God that he always uses crooked sticks to draw straight lines. One author goes on to say, look, don't be shocked that Esther was not as good of a person as you might have originally thought. The truth is that none of us are as good as we think we are. Right? Second, there is no one and no situation beyond redemption. God can change people. No matter how far they've fallen, no matter what cultural lies they've embraced, God can use even our worst decisions and mistakes for his good purposes. Well, that's the beauty of the story of Esther. God's not only going to use Esther as queen to bring about the deliverance of his people, he's actually going to do a work in her to make her into the person that he wants her to be. He's not going to leave her to her compromise. He's not going to leave her to her idolatry. He's going to redeem her. He's going to redeem her entire situation. He's going to make her a new person, and we're going to get to see it unfold. And here's the good news. None of you in this room are beyond that redemption either. None of your friends, none of your family members are beyond redemption. Don't ever think that something that's happened to you, don't ever think that a decision you've made, a compromise you've made, or a sin that you've engaged in, no matter how long you've given yourself over to that, don't ever think that today can't be a different day. Don't ever think that God cannot redeem you. And don't ever think that God cannot do that for someone else either. Just because you've compromised doesn't mean God is finished with you. It's called the book of Esther for a reason. And this is only chapter 1 of her story. Right now, at this point in the story, though, it looks like the God of this world is well in command. Not only is he at work behind the idolatry of the empire, but he's convinced our main character and her cousin to buy into all the lies. But God is on the move. Even though his name is never mentioned, and even though we cannot trace his hand. Like a master storyteller, he's allowing the evil one to weave his own demise through the rise of Esther to power, and he won't even know it until it's too late. Sounds a lot like the cross, doesn't it? Sounds a lot like the cross. The same thing happened there. The enemy thought that he had won. He thought that he had defeated the King of all kings, but it was right there, in fact, that the greatest of all victories was won. In that hour of what seemed like God's greatest defeat, Jesus won an eternal victory. And now when we come to this table every month, we get to remind the devil that he's a defeated foe. You don't think he knows that when we partake of this meal, it reminds him that Jesus, through his broken body and shed blood, was victorious over sin, death, hell, and the grave. And so we partake today really in a sense of celebration. Celebration of the fact that the war is over. That Jesus has won. And he now calls us to live out our days in his victory. Trusting that all our past mistakes, all our past sufferings, all our past compromises can be taken up into God's hands and transformed into something good for his glory. Just like Esther's. So when you come forward this morning, I want to invite you to remember who you are in Christ. On the night that Jesus was betrayed, he took a piece of bread, and sitting around that Passover table with his disciples, he broke the bread. And he gave it to his disciples to eat. And he said, "This is my body broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, after dinner, the Bible says that he took a cup of wine. And he held out that cup of wine before his disciples. And he said, "This wine is the new covenant in my blood, which was shed for the remission of your sin." To receive this today as a follower of Jesus is to be reminded that you are no longer under penalty of sin, but you are now under grace. You've been reconciled and made a new person. So here's what we do at Mountain View Church. Some of you are new. We invite you to come if you're a believer in the Lord Jesus Christ. If you're not this morning, I would encourage you not to partake of this sacred meal, but to take Christ instead, to receive Him and all of His benefits. When the music starts to play, you're welcome to come down the center aisle. There'll be two couples up here, my wife and myself, and the Bryans. And you can come down the center aisle and go one way or the other. Take a piece of bread and dip it in the juice. Take it when you're ready and make your way around the edges back to your seats. All right, are we ready? Are we ready to celebrate Christ's sacrifice for us? I'm going to ask you to bow your heads, and I'm going to pray, and we'll get set up here at the front. And I'm going to serve communion to the worship team as they come. And then when the music starts, you're welcome to come as well.